Do you know what it means to have a revolution? And what it takes to make a solution?
Hi, my name's Andy Higginbottom. I'm an associate professor at Kingston University in London, and I've just got I'm a member of the Colombia Solidarity Campaign and the Plataforma 12 de Octubre, and I'm active in solidarity with people in South Africa and Tamil Elam, and I am an anti-imperialist. And I would like to explain why it's important to maintain that political definition, certainly in the context of being in Britain. I'm just going to bring up my screen. Just please do bear with me. I had it and then I lost it, so I just got to go back to it now. So I'm going to share screen. Can you see my screen, everybody?
Yes.
The argument I'm going to put is that if we want to save the planet, we have to fight imperialism. We not only have to fight imperialism, we have to destroy it. I think the world is living through a complete existential moment, as exactly Melinda said right at the very beginning, where the world system has exhausted its capacity with confronting multiple crises on every level. The possibility of exit from this crisis within capitalism is always present, but it is ever more obvious that an exit within capitalism will mean destruction of the planet. It will mean mass poverty of an even greater scale than we've seen before. I mean, we are facing an apocalypse, basically. And this is not overstating the issue, because the apocalypse has been faced for generations, for the last 500 years in the colonized parts of the world, and finally parts of the global north are beginning to recognize the realities of capitalism as well. And I think that to argue that we should not be anti-imperialist because forces use that discourse for foul ends is to misposition the problem. We have to explain rather what being anti-imperialist means, and we have to rely completely on the most oppressed peoples of the world, the working peoples of the world, who really in the end are the only force who can destroy imperialism. But imperialism has to be destroyed to save the planet. And I'm going to, this picture, by the way, is of a demonstration in London where very rich NGOs tried to stop these young people, most of whom come from Latin America or from Africa, from protesting at the front. And these young people were making the point that in order to defend the planet, we have to destroy imperialism. It's particularly important in Britain, as I'll try to explain. Now, what is the crisis in terms of the environmental crisis? It is hard to overstate how serious the situation is. With the COVID, the world production has fallen by about 10%. Emission of greenhouse gases has fallen by even in the past year. And yet, the carbon dioxide levels, which accumulate over time because they're still being added to, are still growing. So even with the world in the grip of COVID, it is still the case that the move towards climate catastrophe and breakdown is still proceeding. I mean, so the bourgeois press reports that there's more carbon dioxide in the air now than there has been in the last 3 million years. And it's true. Now, this is information diagram. You can't reduce the crisis to just global warming. It's a multi-dimensional crisis. The people who analyze this closely talk about various tipping points. The tipping points in this diagram are actually only one part of the story. We've got a destruction of animal species, we've got destruction of land use, we've got massive pollution in many parts of the world. And in this picture alone, there are 9 tipping points. Several focused on the Arctic and Antarctic. We know that they're melting at an ever-increasing rate. At a certain point, the ice melts too fast, that will never reform, and there'll be an acceleration of the melting and so on. So you have a feedback loop whereby the climatological processes accelerate ecological breakdown. And so when we talk about tipping point, we are into unknown territory. It can be predicted to some degree. Of course, the obvious inclusion here, we can talk about deforestation. Melinda did start off by talking about Guyana being a carbon sink, and we heard about the destruction of forests in Jamaica. Well, I mean, basically the Amazon really is close to being destroyed. Within the next 2 decades, it could be destroyed. So this is not, this is for real. It's on every level. We can see, or we can listen to our friends who directly experience the meltdown in the world's ecological system. And again, just to reinforce a point that was made by Melinda, who is responsible are the imperial powers. The biggest polluters in the world from the Industrial Revolution on are the fossil fuel corporations. This is the case here. We take Exxon. It is responsible for something like 3% of emissions of global greenhouse gases. Chevron used to be part of Standard Oil. It's kind of like not exactly a sister, but a cousin of Exxon today. And the USA, therefore, features towards the top, but you can look slightly down the list. And this is a point I make in relation to my own country, Britain. British multinational oil corporations, BP and Royal Dutch Shell, between them are responsible for more than 5% of all the greenhouse gas emissions in history. In fact, Britain says that it's responsible for just over 1% of global warming. But if you take the actions of its multinational corporations, mining as well as oil and other extractive industries into account, it's an order of magnitude higher. So British-based multinationals are responsible for about 7 or 8% of greenhouse gas emissions. So you have a particularly imperialist country in the case of Britain. Now, Exxon is known alongside Shell and BP as a long-term climate change denier. And this is against the evidence of its own scientists. So in the 1970s and 80s, Exxon scientists were actually doing quite advanced research for the time, and they even published papers to this effect about the projections that they had at that time of global warming. And in fact, their projections are proving more or less correct so far. And they projected in 1982 that climate change would increase global warming by 1.2 degrees. And here we are 38 years later, and in fact, the figure is very close to that. And so what you have is a known rush to the precipice. Exxon, while they were paying these scientists to do this research, have also been paying lobbyists and so on to deny the validity of such research. They are have been major climate change deniers. So this is just a fraction of their spending. This happens to be a press report about their spending in Europe. But of course, and they are not the only ones. Again, I mean, the whole industry has been doing this. Exxon's positioning about going forward is basically pretty much business as usual. It is, amongst the oil companies, one of the most unreconstructed, and now BP and Shell are telling a different story of managed transition to more less polluting energy, alternative energy production. Exxon is very slow to move in that direction. It might well be just a matter of messaging from BP and Shell, but Exxon doesn't even yet see the need to change its messaging. So if you look at the red line, This is Exxon's current research outputs. They're basically seeing that emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, will continue to increase, whereas in the grey line, which you can see there, is what would be required just to keep the Earth increasing its temperature by 1.7 degrees, and the dotted line, which is an even more drastic reduction, 1.5 degrees, is what other international agencies are saying to even get close to the Paris agreements. So what this would mean is a huge reduction in oil production. In other words, in order to meet the Paris commitments, oil production would have to be reduced by over 50%. In fact, 55% to meet 2 degrees and 88% to meet 1.5 degrees global warming. So in any realistic attempt to meet the Paris targets, oil production has to be reduced at the rate of about 7 or 10% a year, every year for the next 10, 15 years. Now, the reforming wing of international capital, which is actually being headed at the moment by Mark Carney, who was the former governor of the Bank of England and will be a crucial player in the next year or two, leading up to the conference in Glasgow next year, which will be COP26. He's basically saying, we see it's a serious problem. We're going to do something about it. We will shift resources out of fossil fuel production into alternative energies, into electric vehicles, into carbon sinks and so on. And the way we'll do this is by a responsible use of green finance. So the system is developing a narrative, a claim that it can have a managed transition without tackling capitalism. And in fact, some of the NGOs are increasingly following the same narrative. Carbon Tracker in particular, which is a very well-researched NGO, is now basically arguing that the oil industry is on the point of collapse, and that from a purely self-interested capitalist interest, asset managers should be shifting their assets out of fossil fuels and into electric and other alternatives. So in other words, they're saying they're cheerleaders for the capitalist solution to the crisis. Now, the big oil companies have lost huge amounts on the stock markets in the last year. Only two of them, which are Chevron and Exxon, have actually lost money from their profits. The others are still making a profit. It's just that they're making less profit than was expected in the past. So their stock market valuations have reduced by about, they fell by about 60% until a week or two ago. They've risen slightly, but they're still hugely down, about 45% down on their valuation before the COVID crisis hit. So what you have is a kind of like a multiplier effect in the stock markets, which is that the expected future profits have fallen, and so the share value capitalization falls even faster. Now, this is important when it comes to the production off the coast of Guyana. The crude is currently around 45 a barrel. Its price has recovered. You may know, of course, from the shale fields in the United States that a lot of that production has gone out of production because it's around $40, $45 its cost of production. According to the producers, and of course they can lie and be deceptive without a doubt in their own interests, but if their accounts are to any degree at all accurate, they're claiming that the production off the coast of Guyana will be at about $25 to $35 a barrel. If that is so, and if oil stays at $45 a barrel, then production will continue to be highly profitable and will continue. So there isn't a market solution to stopping the deepwater Stabroek production. We cannot rely on the stranded assets argument. They will not be left by the markets with capital retreating from them. Rather, the contrary, capital will continue to pour in to expand production offshore. So we have to ask the question of why has this been allowed? And I firmly agree with the conception of neo-colonialism, There's a new book just out by David White, he writes the book called Ecocide, and the subtitle is Why We Must Destroy the Corporation Before It Kills Us. Now, the corporations have the political support of the host state. What he does is he outlines the sort of three main characteristics of the neo-colonial model as he sees it. The first is the corporations get the support of the host state, which permits natural resources and local labour to be exploited. And this is usually connected with bribes. So this is sort of like the basic condition. When we talk about neo-colonialism, it's an agreement, a deal between two willing parties. One is on the imperialist side, the corporation. On the other is on the domestic side, if you like, on the host side, which is the local elite. It takes two to tango, two to make the deal. There's a kind of junior partner and a senior partner in the deal, but it is a deal made voluntarily for class reasons on both sides. Now, the second characteristic that White draws attention to is, of course, this means that any advantages from the fossil fuel or other type of extractive industry go in great disproportion actually to the local elites or on the local population. And this means that conflicts will emerge between the host state and local people. And thirdly, what he points out is that most of the corporations will be backed by their home states. In the case of the US, obviously enough, Rex Tillerson became a leader in Trump's administration, but the sort of structural connections between big oil and US imperialism are well known, as they are in relation to British imperialism and big oil in Britain. Only need to look at the very structure of the Middle East, connection between Saudi Arabia, Aramco, and the United States, the Gulf states and Britain, to see the wealth of connections between imperial power and neo-colonial authoritarian regimes. It's particularly strong in relation to oil, largely because the profits from oil are so big. There's a lot of largesse to go around. A lot of people can be bought. Now, as again, just to repeat really what Melinda was saying quite quickly, this is just a review of the contract in the Staybrook field. What it means is, and I am just repeating just to underline the point really, that the deal will leave Guyana in debt. It will at most generate 3 billion in revenue to the state. That's probably the complete upper limit of the claim by next 4 years. But in that same period, if the projections stay accurate to what they currently are, in the same period, there will be a big hole worth 20 billion, where the oil companies will claim that they've spent money in developing the field and which they must recover from the sale of oil. So in other words, even though the state is at one level apparently getting 60% of the revenue, in reality, it's getting 14% of the revenue and even less, because the further stupidness from a national sovereignty point of view of this deal is that the government has agreed to pay the corporation's income tax as well. So it's an even worse deal. And from even a point of view, which is limited, of national sovereignty, it's a really stupid, one-sided deal. Now, the last point in White's contribution he makes is that the big oil corporations will get political and economic backing from their home states. His point is right, but it doesn't actually go far enough, because what's very clear over the history of the 20th century is that the big oil companies will get military backing from their home states as and when they require it, from Iran, all across the Middle East. The death squads in Oman, the murderous regimes of the Gulf are all protected by a deep connection between their control of the Gulf region and the power of the United States and Britain to control the world's oil supply. This is a very fundamental and structural underpinning of the whole world political economy. Now, Britain recognises this, and so in a recent review of defence, when they say defence, they mean war expenditure and strategy for Britain, climate change became a major sort of factor in the planning. So you can't maybe see the subtitle, it says exploring the implications of climate change for UK defence and security. Now, you might remember the Exxon projections. They were in the range of about 3 degrees or more for 2080, towards the end of the century. These are actually the projections which the British military are actually using, rather than the fine words of the Paris Agreement. When they actually sit down and do their planning, they dispense with the deception of the fine words and get on with what's going to happen when the planet warms by 3.5 degrees. I mean, what scenarios can we predict will occur when this happens? And in their scenario planning, the time horizons vary, but the shortest one is within the next 10 years. They predict, this is the British military's advisors, their think tanks, if you like, they're predicting that there will be huge clashes within 10 years based on resource shortages over food, energy, water supplies. They see the demand for all of these increasing, but the supply not being able to keep up with demand. And that's why, by the way, the military aspect will become more and more important once again. And that's why Boris Johnson has spent, or promises to spend, 16.5 billion over the next 4 years, an increase in expenditure which was welcomed by the equally imperialist Labour Party, who said that it welcomed the extra money. Compare this to the much more publicised increase in spending on so-called green industrial revolution, which would be less than a tenth. 3 billion over 10 years, that's about 300 million a year, a tenth less than the increase in spending on the military. So I am in favour of anti-imperialist for global justice. I think it's needed to stop the ecocide, the killing of the world's ecology. We have to fight imperialism to save the planet. Now we do come to what does it mean to be anti-imperialist? And of course, this can be open to different interpretations. My basic problem in a country like Britain is that the left in particular, but more broadly, aren't anti-imperialist enough. I mean, they don't take it as a serious challenge, what it means to oppose our own ruling class and its imperialism. But what I think it means in particular is extending support to environmentalists, to communities, to grassroots campaigns that are fighting against the Exxon project and all similar projects, in fact. And I think that the agency does have to come from below, plus international solidarity through mobilizations to quite consciously try to break corporate power. And I think that we have a massive challenge to contest global imperialist power on the issue of climate change. It's a massive challenge in terms of narrative. We have to destroy the claim that finance capital will save the planet. And this will all come to a head when Joe Biden comes to Glasgow, which I expect he will do, and shake hands with Boris Johnson in November next year. They will reclaim global leadership for imperialism. And that's, we have to find ways of building up from the grassroots opposition to concrete, real projects which are really destroying the environment, to build that up to a broader narrative to contest the leadership of the imperial powers. I'll leave it there.